A black woman thinks she has the right to judge me. His voice scraped the air like chains dragged across cold stone. The laws in this state were written by me, not for people like you to read. Hook 1. Can you imagine a courtroom where a cop dares to say this to a judge? Stay with us, because this story will shock you. Jonathan Bryant, a white cop, a rabid beast fed by badge and privilege, was now howling in the middle of the courtroom. Facing him, Judge Ayana Williams, a black woman, not a pawn, but the one flipping the entire board. Her gaze was a scalpel, dissecting a system long rotten from within. He couldn't take it. His decaying ego exploded. He lunged, throwing a punch like he could choke out history itself. Ayana's blood hit the courtroom tiles, not as a victim's, but as ink, signing the indictment of an entire system. She stood, no trembling, no retreat, just one sentence, ringing like a funeral bell. Arrest him right now and keep the camera. Justice is no longer a blindfolded goddess. She's a woman who just bled and still stood up. Hook 2. What happens when a judge refuses to back down, even after a punch? You won't believe what she did next. Keep watching on Real Life Story. Has your state ever witnessed a trial like this? Drop a comment below. I want to hear the truth from where you live. The morning in Atlanta began with sunlight that wasn't too harsh, yet strong enough to make the old red bricks outside the Fulton County Courthouse radiate heat. Inside, the wall clock read 8:45 a.m., the typical time for civil cases to start with routine formalities. But that morning, courtroom number 3 didn't feel routine to anyone present. Judge Ayana Williams entered in her long black robe. Her expression was calm, her gaze unwavering. She had been through plenty of tense trials before, but this one felt different. Across the room sat Officer Jonathan Bryant, accompanied by his attorney. His fingers were interlaced. His back leaned casually against the chair. He wore a smug, self-assured smile, the kind worn by a man who knew the system would always shield him. Bryant wasn't an ordinary cop. He had been implicated in at least 4 excessive force incidents and 2 racially charged cases with clear evidence. Yet, he had always walked away unscathed. Internal reports vanished. Witnesses changed their stories. Investigators said nothing. This time, the case involved a confrontation with an unarmed black teenager at a gas station. At first, it seemed minor, but a video that spread online showed Bryant clearly assaulting the young man. No warning, no provocation. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, but like always, it stalled. That was how the civil lawsuit ended up in Ayana's courtroom. It wasn't a criminal proceeding. There would be no badge stripped, no formal charges, just a victim trying to reclaim his dignity. For Ayana, though, it was more than that. It was a rare opportunity to force at least one part of the system to answer for its actions. She opened the file and glanced briefly at Bryant. He was still smiling, that same practiced smirk that seemed to say he had seen dozens like her before, and none had ever laid a finger on him. She didn't respond, but inside she knew if she lost control of this trial, no one else would have the courage to step forward again. And the wind, barely slipping through the courtroom window, seemed to carry with it the faint, lingering scent of gunpowder from generations past. Jonathan Bryant sat in the defendant's chair as if it had been designed just for him. He didn't lean back like someone listening intently or showing respect to the court. Instead, he rested in a deliberate slouch, legs crossed, one elbow propped on a knee, the other hand toying with a silver-plated pen he clearly had no intention of using. It was not the posture of a man under legal threat. It was the posture of someone long accustomed to living in a world where the law served as little more than a thin veil for privilege. He wore a spotless white shirt with the sleeves rolled high and the top buttons undone. No tie, no jacket, a quiet, pointed message. This meant nothing to him because he already knew how it would end. Each time the plaintiff's attorney introduced evidence, surveillance, screenshots, testimonies of screams, photos of bruised faces, Bryant responded not with concern, but with the practiced smirk of a man who'd seen this show before. The smirk was calculated, not deep enough to be called contempt, but never subtle enough to mask the mockery. He nodded slowly, like he was applauding a tired performance whose ending he could recite by heart. His gaze drifted lazily around the courtroom, from the observers to the press row. When his eyes met a black journalist's scribbling notes, he gave a faint smile and shrugged, as if to say, "Write whatever you want. None of it matters." Then he locked eyes with Judge Ayana Williams, who was reviewing a transcript. He kept staring until she looked up. Her face remained unreadable, the way she had been trained. But that very neutrality seemed to irritate him. He smiled, not broadly or long, but just enough to pull tension into the room. Bryant had once said at a private dinner, in the company of lawyers and industry friends, "She's judging me, a black woman, thinking she can sit above me." He didn't repeat those words in court, but every muscle in his body seemed to scream them. He wasn't here to answer to justice. He was here to play a game, the kind where he was always the cat, and even the judge in black robes was just another mouse dressed up as authority. When the first witness, a nervous young black man of about 23, took the stand and described a sudden punch from Bryant at a gas station, Bryant didn't look at him. Instead, he scanned the courtroom, looking for anyone who might still believe in him. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something. The lawyer frowned and shook his head. Bryant didn't seem to care. A few seconds later, he chuckled out loud, not loudly, but enough to pierce the quiet and disrupt the witness's words. Judge Ayana struck her gavel. "Defendant, maintain order." Bryant turned to her with an easy nod. "Apologies, Your Honor," he said smoothly, as if he'd rehearsed it. But his eyes held no apology. They were empty, cold, and slow, in a way that made it seem he had already won and was just watching the final act for amusement. Ayana glanced at the file before her, fingers tightening on her red pen. Part of her wanted to shut him down immediately, but experience, 10 years of walking the line inside this system, told her to wait, let him dig his own grave. In the back row, Lena, Ayana's clerk, leaned over to the court reporter and whispered, "How many times has he done that?" The woman sighed. "This is the 6th time I've seen him laugh while a victim cried." Meanwhile, Bryant sat back, arms folded, smirk fixed in place, a smirk that dropped the room's temperature just enough to make everyone feel it. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't afraid. In his mind, as long as his kind wrote the laws, no one like Ayana could touch him. But in Ayana's mind, one thought rose with the clarity of a gavel strike: no one is born untouchable, not with me on the bench. Elsewhere, deep in the courthouse, ADA Marcus Hale stood by a narrow window overlooking the street. His coffee had long gone cold, untouched. His eyes followed the slow crawl of cars under the early sun. A calm morning outwardly, but inside he felt the churn of something heavy and familiar. He knew cases like this, the sensitive ones, the ones that came with whispered instructions and quiet endings. Jonathan Bryant had been at the center of many. None had gone to trial. No charges, no headlines, just meetings behind doors and firm reminders not to let things escalate. That morning, he'd taken a call. No introduction, just a flat voice over speakerphone, directive from above. "Don't let this trial spiral. Bryant has strategic value." That phrase, strategic value, twisted his gut. He didn't like Bryant. Never had. But worse was the realization that he, Hale, had become part of someone else's game. As ADA, he understood the written law, but he also knew the unwritten one: quiet influence, off-the-record deals, unspoken power that controlled outcomes. In another hallway, Lena adjusted the overhead camera, ensuring the feed remained uninterrupted. She had less than 3 years on the job, but already sensed something was different today. As 2 security officers passed, she overheard one mutter, "This judge better be careful. She's going too far." It wasn't a threat, not outright. That made it worse. Lena stood still for a moment, chilled. She knew she had just heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. And in that instant, she understood this wasn't just a courtroom. It was a battlefield, one where both sides had things to lose. And not all blood would stain paper. Upstairs, sunlight angled through the high windows, cutting across the bench and casting a blade-like glow on Ayana's face. She sat upright, hands loosely clasped over the file, eyes never leaving Bryant. Not the eyes of a neutral judge. The eyes of someone who had seen evil, survived too many courtrooms, who knew the system's cracks because she had once lived inside them. She didn't need to look down to remember how many accusations Bryant had escaped. She knew the number by heart, more than she knew the names of the jurors seated before her. She had seen this smugness before. Her own family had been crushed by the same kind of strategic value now protecting him. Bryant stayed relaxed, one leg draped over the other, still wearing that tired smile. He had no idea, or chose not to know, that today, across from him sat a different kind of judge, one who didn't scare easily, one who had seen the worst of the law and still chose to stand inside it. For Ayana, this wasn't just a civil case. It was a beginning. She knew her words were being recorded, twisted. She knew one wrong move could bury the case like so many others. Voices continued echoing through the chamber, legal and formal. But under that surface flowed a current, sharp, electric, threading between power and principle. And in the light striking Ayana's face, one truth became visible: not everyone in a robe merely reads the law. Some, like her, come to rewrite it, starting in the very place that once tried to silence them. The trial had barely begun, but the lines had been drawn, and Jonathan Bryant, still smirking like a man above consequence, had no idea he'd picked the wrong person to challenge. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to Real Life Story for more gripping tales of justice. The trial resumed that morning with all the outward decorum expected in a courtroom. But beneath the surface, the tension inside Courtroom 3 had begun to thicken, like mist before a storm. The plaintiff's lawyer grew more incisive with each question, and as more evidence flashed across the large screen, the facade of composure Jonathan Bryant wore began to crack. When the footage from the gas station camera was played, clearly showing Bryant punching an unarmed black teenager without any warning, a strange, heavy silence fell over the room. Ayana didn't look at the screen. She had already seen it many times. Instead, she kept her eyes on Bryant, observing how he reacted to his own actions, mirrored back through the public eye. Bryant leaned forward slightly, his right hand clenched, fingers twitching, not from remorse, but from rising anger. The veins in his neck stood out as he tried to control himself, but frustration flickered in every quick blink, every clench of his jaw. When asked if he had seen the victim raise his hands and surrender, Bryant didn't respond right away. He looked toward the jury, as if gauging whether they might buy into the self-defense story he was about to spin, and then let out a faint, mocking laugh. He said he saw a kid about to attack him, and he defended himself. Ayana, tilting her head and adjusting her glasses, delivered her next words with precision. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was cutting. She asked if he considered an unprovoked punch to be a legal act of self-defense. She didn't expect a real answer. She posed the question so that everyone in the room, from the jury to the press to the public, would have to confront what they were witnessing. Her voice didn't need to rise. Its icy clarity alone commanded attention. Bryant turned his gaze toward her. There was no anger or fear in it, only unfiltered contempt. He said he didn't need her to teach him the law. And the way he emphasized ma'am dripped with sarcastic derision, a mix of sexism and racism wrapped in a mockingly polite tone. Around the room, reactions stirred. A few people frowned. Some jurors exchanged quiet glances, and the court clerk momentarily held their breath. But Ayana remained calm. She tapped her pen on the file and stated that only one person was being questioned, and it wasn't her. Then, without softening, she asked why Bryant believed he had never been disciplined, despite facing 6 prior complaints for similar conduct. That question wasn't scripted. It wasn't the kind of thing attorneys usually dared to say, especially not during a live broadcast trial. But Ayana understood that justice doesn't always live in statutes. It sometimes needs to be spoken plainly, at the right time, in the right voice. The room froze. Even those who believed in proper procedure couldn't deny the weight of what she had said. Bryant squinted, fully aware that this was no ordinary cross-examination. Her question had pierced through the shield he had long relied upon. He leaned forward slightly and muttered something that the microphone didn't catch. But Ayana heard it. It wasn't an answer. It was a threat, not against the court, but against her, the one who dared to look him in the eye and expose the truth that had been hidden for so long. In his eyes, Ayana saw it clearly, this was no longer a legal exchange between a judge and a defendant. It was a collision between two belief systems, one that trusted in the law's power to repair, and one that viewed the law only as a means of domination. No one moved. Even the court reporter's pen had stopped. Something hung in the air, stretched taut like a string about to snap. And in Ayana's mind, a question flashed: was what was about to happen a continuation of history, or a moment to rewrite it? Bryant hadn't yet moved, but Ayana could see it in his clenched jaw, his grinding teeth, and the way his fist tightened. The storm was imminent. In the dense silence that followed her last question, something trembled between held breath and swelling rage. Bryant stood abruptly, without a word or warning. The sudden motion pushed his chair backward with a loud thud, startling the court reporter into dropping a pen. Within seconds, he had charged past the attorney's tables, eyes locked on Ayana like a predator cornered and ready to strike. No bailiff reacted in time. No one stopped him. Then a loud impact reverberated through the room. The punch landed square on Ayana's face, heavy, purposeful, and completely unrestrained. It wasn't just a strike. It was the culmination of years of unchecked power, of violence institutionalized, of the belief that the law belonged only to men like him. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Screams rang out from reporters, from a female juror who burst into tears, from a lawyer shouting "Stop, far too late." Ayana reeled backward, her head hitting the bench hard, blood spilling from one cheek. Her lips turned purple from the force, but she didn't cry out. Her body swayed, yet she didn't fall. One hand gripped the bench, anchoring her upright. Then the room erupted. Bailiffs shouted into radios. Spectators were forced out. Live cameras flickered as heads blocked the view in confusion. Everything spun in panic except Ayana. She remained at the center, motionless, her eyes closed, blood tracing down her cheek. Bryant was tackled and pinned by 3 officers. He screamed and thrashed, cursing without pause. He shouted that she deserved it, that she wasn't his judge, that this was his land, that the law belonged to them. His voice cracked with rage, no longer arrogant, just wild and animalistic. What shocked the room wasn't just his violence, but his certainty that he was entitled to act that way. Ayana still didn't speak. Her face twisted in pain, but she made no sound. Her breathing was sharp, deliberate. Her eyes shut tightly, holding back not just the pain, but something deeper, fury. A few court staff members approached hesitantly, one asking in a shaky voice if she was all right. Ayana raised a hand gently, signaling them to stay back. She didn't want to be touched. Not yet. She took a breath. Another. A third. Then opened her eyes. What showed in them was not fear, not rage, just a terrifying calm, the composure of someone who had seen the ugliest sides of power. She clutched the bench, steadied herself, and rose. Blood still dripped onto her robe, her hair slightly disheveled, her shoulder low from the blow, but her back was straight, frighteningly straight. The room held its breath as she stood. Officers still held Bryant to the floor, but all eyes turned to her. No one knew what she would do next. Ayana stood firm, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. Her voice came, not raised or theatrical, but ringing clear as a bell. "I didn't think you held the law in such contempt." The room froze. One officer glanced at another, about to speak, but after seeing the look in her eyes, sharp and final, he said nothing and simply nodded. No judge in U.S. judicial history had ever been attacked so brazenly at the bench and continued as though nothing had happened. But in that moment, Ayana Williams was no longer just a judge. She was the living proof that the system, fractured though it might be, still had hope, not because it was unbroken, but because someone had the courage to rise within the cracks, wipe away the blood, and continue. A punch had been thrown at justice, but it hadn't brought her down. And that silence, that awe, was what shook everyone more than the violence itself. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned to Real Life Story to see how Ayana fights back against a corrupt system. Blood from Ayana's cheek streamed down to her chin, soaking into the collar of her black robe and clinging to strands of hair matted against her temple. Her head spun, not from the force of the punch, but from the fact that it happened at all, in the middle of a trial, under bright lights, in full view of a courtroom filled with witnesses to what was supposed to be the order of justice. Her hearing dissolved into a long static hum, like distorted radio noise swallowing up all other sounds. For a few brief seconds, everything became distant, except one thing, her right hand gripping the edge of the bench, anchoring her to reality. Her hand was cold, but her gaze was not. Her eyes stayed open, not searching for help, not looking upward, but silently processing everything with a kind of strength that no law book could teach. She could feel the chaos around her: running footsteps, shouts, the clatter of weapons against justice officers' belts as they restrained Bryant, the smell of sweat, the dust of the benchwood, and her own blood. It all mixed into a scent she would never forget, the scent of power when tested and survived. A woman somewhere sobbed. A reporter stuttered her name into a microphone. Ayana didn't respond. She knew that if she rose like a victim, everything she believed in would collapse. If she allowed herself to be seen as a casualty, this entire trial would be reduced to an isolated incident. That could not happen. The question pulsed in her mind, without anyone needing to speak it aloud: if he dared to do this here, in public, under the lights, with the entire system watching, then what else would he dare do out there, where there's no law, no light? The question wasn't just for Bryant. It was for everyone watching through their screens, for those in expensive suits a few blocks away, for leaders who had remained silent through dozens of complaints and had never punished a single officer. Ayana exhaled once, sharply. Her grip tightened. She felt the tendons in her wrist stretch. One side of her head throbbed, but she ignored it. She started to rise slowly, like someone climbing from rubble. No one in the courtroom moved to stop her. A few took cautious steps forward, but her stare froze them in place, not pleading, not angry, just firm, with a single message: this is still my courtroom. When she stood fully, her feet steady on the cold tile, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her hair was disheveled, blood still streaked her chin. Her robe hung slightly off-center, but her spine remained straight, frighteningly straight. She didn't look at the defendant pinned to the floor. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight ahead, toward the jury holding its breath, toward those still believing in law, waiting for a sign. And she knew, in that moment, not through argument, not through verdict, but by simply remaining on her feet, she had said the most important thing of all: I did not fall. Her rising wasn't physical resistance. It was a declaration, a punch in reverse, thrown at anyone who believes power lives in a fist and not in the ability to take the hit and remain dignified. Ayana didn't need to scream to prove her strength. Her refusal to retreat, bleeding and all, yet still commanding, directing, deciding, shook the entire system more than any act of violence ever could. From the corner, Lena stood frozen, tablet clutched tight. She had never witnessed anything like it. Everything she'd learned about justice, power, the courtroom, it was all being rewritten right in front of her. And the one rewriting it wasn't using ink, but blood. No one expected Ayana to seek revenge. She didn't need to. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't request leave. She did just one thing: she stood up, rightly and at exactly the right moment. And that alone made privilege tremble. Bryant lay face down on the tile, arms twisted behind his back. The justice officers still hadn't agreed on the next move. One mumbled into his radio, voice low: do we move him out or keep him here to prevent escalation? The question hung in the earpiece. No one answered. The system hesitated, not because it didn't know what to do, but because no one dared decide in this moment without precedent. On the bench, Judge Ayana Williams stood, her face bloodied, her expression calm. She glanced at a corner of the room where 4 cameras were still live, then fixed her eyes on the defendant thrashing on the ground. In her mind, there was no more noise, no more lights, no more bleeding, just one question: what will they do if I stay silent? And then the answer came, cold and clear: if I don't seize power now, I will lose it forever. She took one step toward the edge of the bench, her voice steady, not loud, but echoing through the room like an order on a battlefield: detain him here. No removal. Keep the cameras rolling. Everything will be recorded, uncut, unedited. This wasn't rage. It wasn't a victim's outburst. It was the voice of someone fully aware of what they were commanding: a trial, a historical moment, and a system being forced into the light. The officers exchanged glances. One nodded, whispered to another, and tightened Bryant's cuffs. No one dared move from their post. They knew if this incident left the courtroom in chaos, someone would bury it before the evening news. But if it played out exactly as Ayana commanded, there was no going back. They knew they were caught between two forces: justice and protectionism. And for the first time, justice had just raised its head.